Hey everybody, it's Moment of Mod, Emilie Yeager from Credmark. We are back with our second part in our AMA series explaining Credmark, the platform, data ETL, and all the things that we do here. As you can see, we have upgraded from the really glossy, bad whiteboard to a really pretty mural that our good friend here in Austin, Texas made. We're all very proud of it.
I like that I can stand on Moment's head while I'm talking.
So I think this is a much better setting for these, and I think we'll probably do it here. Sorry about the link. Still getting used to streaming software. It's not my strong suit, but we'll get smooth with these going forward. I think we will start just by having Emilie introduce herself and maybe explain her experience and why that's an interesting component to the whole Credmark family.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Emilie Yeager. My background is in DevOps. Started out, computer science, help desk, system administration, and those words started turning into tech ops and then DevOps. And so I've been working specifically with Amazon Cloud for 10 years, so pretty early on in Amazon Cloud years. And so I've worked with Neil on other projects and other companies, and so he wanted to bring my expertise into here, even though I lack crypto experience. What I do for companies is I automate structure. So that's a very important part of about.
Yeah, I was going to say, why, I think that really leads into the question of why you are at Credmark.
Yep.
Especially with the topic of automation. Maybe touch on sort of the question that you're trying to answer, or the answer that you have to our question of how do we decentralize everything.
So I, have a lot of experience in the automation portion. So some of that though is centralized automation. So there was a bit of a learning curve for us to figure out how do we get each piece into a decentralized automation. So we're going to stair-step our way there, but we want to use tools and open source software that people have been using for a while that's tried and true. So then we can also pave the way for other people coming from traditional backgrounds to be able to come into crypto, and it just makes more sense.
So it's important to mention that while smart contracts have successfully sort of done the whole decentralized automation part, everything else around that from the technology standpoint is still very much manual in crypto. Data storage, pipelines, all that kind of stuff is still pretty early, and so I think getting someone like Emilie, who in the position that she's in, is a really interesting move for us because it allows us to be at the forefront of the automation of all the boards. Right? It's also interesting that we brought on someone who didn't have previous crypto experience, and I think that speaks to our goal of providing a platform that everyone on the technical side can build on, and not just Solidity devs or crypto finance. Is there anything you can talk about as far as opening this up to the larger developer world, or maybe how your not lack of experience in crypto, but sort of experience in other areas can feed into creating an environment that can be more inclusive?
Yeah. There's just a lack of expertise in crypto. Most people who are in it already are working on projects. So it's important to be able to bring in more talent to this realm, and so at some point you have to bite that bullet and pave the way. So like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to take tried and true practices in open source software that people are used to using and adapting it to the crypto realm. And so we want to be able to also bring in others that have less crypto experience, and can kind of advise a little bit in that, of how to bridge that gap and have it make sense moving forward for someone who wants to go from a traditional background into a crypto technology company.
Cool. Let's dive into the actual meat of the issue, which is the data ETL itself. I think before you came on, we had plans of leveraging third parties, and we quickly realized that that is just not really tenable. Can you talk about why we chose to do the incredibly difficult task of building our own ETL?
So at our core, we're a data company, and if our data is from another source, that just creates a dangerous situation for us. Also, since the data is publicly available on blockchain, it makes sense that we're downloading it directly from chain versus adding someone else in the middle. There's also a question of scale and how they're doing things. So as far as like a disaster recovery situation where something goes technically wrong, if we don't have access to fix any of that, it creates a bad situation for us, and we want to be a very credible, stable resource. So us having control is important.
So that brings up an interesting kind of conundrum. We have decided we don't want to rely on a third party to get our data, yet we expect most of DeFi to eventually use Credmark as a source of truth for very specific risk metrics.
Okay.
How do we justify that sort of thing?
Yeah, that seems a little backward. If we're not willing to trust someone else, why would someone want to trust us?
Right.
So we are building out a lot of documentation. So we have our risk library, which we'll be expanding upon, and we also, with any API releases and as we're using more of our own data, it's going to be very well documented. So technically anyone else could replicate what we're doing because it's that well documented and open sourced. It will take time and effort, so I don't advise it. So we will have everything out there to be a credible resource. We will have documentation for disaster recovery if something terrible should happen. And a lot of the other parties out there, we just haven't seen that kind of structure and documentation.
Cool. Let's get into the data itself. You want to pull up that graphic? Yeah. So
we're being told our microphones aren't loud enough, so we'll try to be better. I'll scream at you all.
Speak loud.
So yeah, we've got data split up into, so far we've defined 3 orders. As the graphic shows, there's first and second. Can you talk about first order and kind of what? I know you had to export it directly from the Ethereum node and get it into our own sort of data warehouse. You might want to talk about that process and like why it was so difficult.
Yeah, so this first order data, as we've defined these terms, and so that was my crash course into crypto data. So we utilized open source tooling, Ethereum ETL, to export from the blockchain to put it into a data lake. We wanted to avoid using any SQL-based databases since those don't scale very well. And so we're exporting to Amazon data lakes, and we can query there still in a SQL format. And so the data itself it's raw. So that means all of the fields are mostly either numbers or hex values.
Yeah, can we bump up to the next graphic that shows the Athena?
So here's an example, very tiny little text here, of what a query would return. So none of that means anything to most people. So that's where this second order data comes in. We have to take this first order, combine it with ABIs from other smart contracts out there to interpret it into that second order data that's actually human readable.
And I know that involves something called an ABI. Can you briefly describe, if you can, in a very high level what an ABI does. I've always thought of it as like an interpretation filter, right? You have all this raw data, you apply an ABI from a specific smart contract, and it makes it readable. Is that right?
Yeah. So again, my basic understanding of how these things are working now. So you can look up the contracts, and you can find out the methods, essentially the functions within that. So each ABI or smart contract could have different functions that the protocol has decided to write about. So we need to find out what each of those functions are so that the transactions make sense. So we know what the transaction actually was doing and what it was doing, why and what.
Cool.
So it's pairing that function data with the raw to get the output of what happened in history.
Right, it's like the interpretation part that makes any of the things that we plan to do possible. I think we have a cool graphic that sort of explains the exporting process. Do you want to maybe walk through what this means?
Yes.
If you can, and it's pretty technical, but
It is and it isn't. So I do want to touch on Amazon. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we know that we're glued into Amazon right now, and it's a goal to be more agnostic later, but step one, we gotta walk first. So here we're utilizing Amazon services that already exist, so we don't have to manage servers themselves. So we use some auto scaling groups with some EC2 instances to export from the blockchain using the open source tool that I called Ethereum ETL. We're dumping that into Amazon S3, which is just a storage bucket. So in that storage bucket, then we have CSV data. So now we need to get that into something that is more queryable. The problem with CSVs is that if you're running any kind of query or search, it's going to open the entire file, and that gets really expensive. So we utilized Amazon Glue service, which, the little icon they have there, it's a funnel. So you can take information and transform it, translate it. So we translated it into Apache Parquet files that's also stored on that S3 bucket data store. So the Parquet files allow us to query. It's a columnar format, so then we don't have to open the entire file. We can just look at certain columns that we're querying for, and it's a lot cheaper and more sustainable. It's a lot faster as well. So that's how we got to our first order data. We got all of history, and now we're streaming all new blocks that are being created.
You brought up speed.
Yeah.
And I remember when we first ran a demo of us querying those Parquet files, we kind of compared it apples to apples to what could be considered a competitor in Dune. And we haven't done too much work into looking into exactly how our sort of competitors on the data side, which would be Dune and the graph, sort of what their architecture looks like. But we do know that they are leveraging Postgres, which is a very popular querying language. It's pretty much just SQL language, and is useful in the sense that it's easy to learn. So they've both developed pretty big communities off of that fact. But it also presents some problems, right? And do you want to maybe touch on what those problems might be, not problems, but differences could be between how they're potentially storing data and how we want to eventually get to the same thing, potentially in a more optimized way?
Yeah, so the fallbacks of using something like Postgres, normally you'd have like a database administrator to manage a lot of that. Nowadays, yes, we have centralized things like Amazon that can host things for you, but there's still a lot of maintenance to make sure that your database has enough storage, that it has enough CPU and memory so it can return things fast enough. And it's a little harder to move data around as well. You have to go through massive migrations if you need to fix anything or add a row or column in, a column in. So it's more difficult, and that doesn't sound like decentralization. So we wanted to start with using tools that are serverless and, run off of data stores that were not stuck to anything. So using Apache Parquet, we could honestly run that in anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And long term, we have potentials of using other types of databases that run either on-chain or like blockchain,
Mm-hmm.
like BigChainDB is something like that. So the first order data is less important on how we store it because it's a replica of what already exists on-chain. So then once we get into the translations and the second order, and there's an additional third and fourth orders,
Mhm.
which we have not mentioned here.
Right.
We will talk about those some future date. Those are the things that we need to store somewhere that is decentralized, and we're working towards making sure it's sustainable.
So we were going to have questions at the end of this, but it looks like there's one that's pretty relevant. And you've already kind of touched on it, how we intend on shifting away from Amazon, and how we, if we bump back to the notes, how we plan on actually decentralizing.
Yeah, so there's two pieces. There is data store, and then there's essentially computation. So computation, a lot of people are using nodes. You can run your own node for many protocols out there. So we will be doing that, most likely via containers, so that people can, replicate and run their own container that is a Credmark node that helps do computation. So that's most likely the path we'll be going for that. And then for storage, we have to we're going to test a lot of things to find the best way, but we know there's IPFS, we know there's BigChainDB, and there's probably more options that will.
I mean, there's also things like Filecoin, which
Yeah.
is not quite the right type of storage, I don't
Mhm.
think, but it seems like the possibility of another DAO emerging that could service that
Yeah.
could be interesting, but
Essentially, we're a big data company that needs to exist in this decentralized,
Yeah. which is almost
automated.
kind of counterintuitive to what people think of big data. You think of Facebook or Amazon or Netflix.
Yeah.
Very centralized, sort of scary
Mhm.
entities, and we want to be the opposite. Can we talk about what the future of, so like for our engineers, developers, I know those terms are not necessarily the right, I think it's engineers is the one that you,
Engineer is the word I like to
for the
use.
engineers building on Credmark. Obviously now it's still, we're still in like a dashboard sort of phase. We haven't really opened up the full sort of scope of the platform, but in the future, what can engineers expect to work with when dealing with our platform?
Yeah, so the platform, this is partly what we need community members for, to voice who they are so we can understand what they need. So there's many avenues, and we'll probably do a combination of these kinds of things. We'll have a visual dashboard that you can log into and see for people who don't know what to do, but you still care about data and what's happening. Then we will have API access for developers and engineers who actually want to consume that data, do something with it, transform it into what they need it for. And then there, we could have somewhere in the middle of like data analysts that like to download data in specific formats, like usually CSV or Excel or something that can be downloaded into a Jupyter notebook, something that like data scientists and data analysts can consume. So there's a combination of those things that we will have in the future.
Yeah, we do employ a team of engineers and analysts so that we're kind of learning what they like to work with.
Exactly.
But the community is going to be really important in sort of introducing potentially a different angle of what people want to work with and how they work with. So going forward, we're really hoping to leverage our technical community a bit more. We already kind of have in the hackathon, which was an interesting like case study and like a manual process of how this this platform ecosystem could function. Do you want to touch on maybe what the hackathon, not the hackathon like the topic itself, but maybe like the processes around it sort of implicated for us?
Yeah, so the hackathon, we were not using our data for that. So we're doing a lot of things in parallel. So the hackathon was our way of kind of manually getting the engineering community involved and engaged and showing what the platform could do once the platform is made. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something we're going to continue to do. We definitely learned a lot from the first one, but when it comes to distributing data to developers and sort of making that process smooth, I think it's really important we do that on a regular basis. So once we get to the point of automating it, we know exactly where all the pitfalls are.
And if we wait to do these kinds of things until a product is done, it's going to be a long time, and that's not what we want to do.
Just like waiting to test your live stream out right when you do the live stream cannot be there.
But hey, we have a nice setup though.
Let's get to some questions. Let's see. Let's talk about data structure. Because you've worked in DeFi now for 3 or 4 months, can you talk at all on what structure exists or lack thereof in DeFi, and why you think that what we're doing can be really helpful as far as, providing data that's actually high integrity, verifiable, and then can be used effectively to produce models?
Yeah. So we have a team right now. We're growing it, and so I'm looking for more expertise in data engineering that will help us answer some of these things in more detail. But could you ask that one more time?
Just structure, data structure. How is there a lack of structure right now in DeFi that you've noticed, and what problems does that present?
Yeah, I can't say for sure if there's a lack of technical structure, but there's a lack of process and documentation. Typically, with a SaaS platform, making a partnership with another large company, there would be a security questionnaire. Mm-hmm. And within that security questionnaire, there's also expectation of architecture documents and disaster recovery. I know I've mentioned that term a bunch of times, but it's important to acknowledge that when something happens, you have a plan. So I've seen that lacking in crypto, and I would love to see more of it, especially since we are trying to be credible and prove that we will be around for a while.
Right, yeah, the documentation side is something we've really focused a lot on. I think we got to wrap it up, so we're going to have one more question. This is probably the most popular question from community members, investors, partners, and that is, because we were doing this all in a transparent way, what stops people? One, what is stopping people from just copying what we're doing and doing it themselves? And two, if the answer to that is yes, they can, what is the value that we provide?
Yeah. Yes, you can totally replicate what we're doing. We will make everything available on GitHub as we make it, and make sure there's no secrets or passwords anywhere like that. We'll make that available. You can copy what we've done. It takes time and it takes money. You do have to pay for those bills, and you do have to have a team that knows how to support it and maintain it. So it's possible, but you gotta put in time and money.
Yeah, I mean, if it was easy, I think people would have their own permissionless data ETLs all over the place. Yeah. But so far, there's really only 2. So I think that just goes to show that what Emilie specifically is working on is extremely difficult and extremely important to the health of this project. So that's gonna wrap things up for this AMA. We will be back next week, which will discuss the Risk Library and Risk Terminal, which will be coming out very, very soon. and that will be a combination of Hassan and Collier discussing the implications of sort of the outputs of our platform. So Emilie's talking about the data itself. Neil mentioned the tokenomics and community aspect of our platform, and Hassan and Collier are going to cover sort of the outputs. So what are the impacts of the research and the work that we do here at Credmark. As always, you can find us in our Discord, on Twitter, and these AMAs will become blog posts in a series that I'm putting out over the course of the next few weeks, so you can get sort of a summary of all the things we've talked about. And yeah, Stein is telling me to say something. Oh, yeah, say thank you. Thank you to all for watching and showing up. We're gonna get this whole AMA thing looking much better every time. And thanks to Emilie for.
I had to push through a lot of anxiety to do this, so he really has to thank me.
And with that, we'll call it. We'll wrap it up. Till next time.